We descend into the shadows of the past to unearth a story that has been deliberately buried for centuries. We journey into a world where love was not just forbidden, but was considered a crime against God himself. A world where a simple, heartfelt connection could cost a woman everything she had. Imagine being a young woman, barely more than a girl, standing at a convent gate. Your family has given you to the church, or a daughter too many, now pledged to be a bride of Christ. Your life is meant to be one of silent prayer and devotion, but then a visitor, or perhaps another sister with eyes that hold a universe of understanding, catches your gaze. In that fleeting moment, your heart beats a rhythm that has nothing to do with hymns and everything to do with a deeply human, stolen glance is the beginning of a terrifying secret. For the women we speak of, the medieval nuns of Europe, falling in love was a path that led to public humiliation and even a lonely, unmarked grave. They were supposed to be married to God, their passions devoted solely to the divine. Beneath the coarse wool of their habits, their hearts still yearned for the warmth of human affection. What you are about to discover is not just a collection of forgotten rules. It is the story of the psychological chains that bound millions of women for hundreds of years. And the stories, the incredible, heartbreaking stories of love and rebellion, they tried so desperately to erase from history. These are the whispers they could not silence. Before we unlock these forbidden tales together, I want to invite you to become a part of our storytelling circle. If these secret histories ignite a fire in you, as they do in me, then take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's more than just a click. It's a signal that these lost voices deserve to be heard, and it helps me to keep digging, to bring more of these incredible untold stories. Where are you on your journey tonight? Are you settled in for the evening? Or are you stealing a quiet moment in a busy world? Drop a comment below and let me know. I genuinely love knowing who I'm sharing these stories with. Now, if you're ready, dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away. Let's step back in time and listen to the secrets the stones have been keeping. Picture the world of Sister Isabel. At 17, she entered the Abbey of Fontevraud, a jewel of the French countryside. Her family, wealthy and powerful, saw her entry not as a spiritual calling, but as a strategic placement. They paid a dowry to the church that could have funded a small army. Isabel surrendered her name, her future, and her freedom. She walked down the aisle in a white gown, an eerie imitation of a wedding, and placed a cold, silver ring on her finger. She was now a sponsor Christi, a bride of Christ. But this marriage was a contract of suppression, a vow to extinguish the very fires of human desire that make us who we are. The vows she took were iron chains forged in piety. First, the vow of poverty. This was not the simple humility of owning nothing. It was a brilliant, ruthless legal maneuver. The moment Isabel spoke the words, her inheritance, her lands, her jewels, everything that gave her power and independence in the world, was irrevocably transferred to the church. She was now a voluntary pauper, economically trapped. A nun who left a convent didn't just break a vow. She became a penniless refugee in a world where a woman without wealth or a male guardian had no place. The church had not just saved her soul, it had acquired her assets, the vow of chastity. This went far beyond the simple promise of celibacy. It was a vow against intimacy in all its forms. Any carnal affection was forbidden. This included deep friendships, emotional bonds, even what the church called excessive grief for a dead parent. Love, in its purest, most platonic form, was a sin. Sister Genevieve, an older nun who had been at the abbey since she was 12, had once been punished for holding the hand of her dying sister for too long. Her penance was 40 days of fasting for crime of showing excessive worldly attachment. But the third vow, obedience, was the most psychologically devastating. It was a complete surrender of one's will. A nun had to obey her superiors without question, even if the command felt morally wrong. It was this vow that turned the convent into a prison of the mind, where every sister was a potential informant, and the mother superior was a warden of their souls. Life within the abbey was a masterpiece of control, a medieval panopticon designed to crush individuality and prevent the one thing the church feared most, particular friendships. This was their code for any close. The day began at 3 a.m, but with the violent clang of a bell tower, the first of 8 daily prayer sessions that sliced the day into a rigid, unyielding schedule. Even moments of supposed private prayer, nuns had to meditate in designated areas, in full view of one another. To seek a quiet corner for one's own thoughts was to invite suspicion. The work they were assigned was deliberately mind-numbing. Hours were spent in the scriptorium, copying religious texts by hand. This wasn't about preservation of knowledge. It was about mental exhaustion disguised as holy work. To spend all day copying the same Bible passages was to numb the part of the mind that might otherwise have time to feel, to desire, to dream. Brutal tool control was a rule of silence. In most convents, nuns were only permitted to speak for 2 hours a day during designated recreation periods. Imagine living with dozens of sharing every aspect of your life, yet being shrouded in a cloak of enforced silence. The psychological pressure was immense. As one nun wrote in a hidden diary, became a living thing, pressing it on you until you wanted to scream, just to prove you still had a voice. It was in this suffocating silence that a secret world bloomed. Denied a voice, the nuns of Fonavrad in convents across Europe, a language of glances, of small, stolen gestures, of the way a prayer book was placed upon a bench. A shared smile held for a second too long, a brief touch of hands while passing in the cloister, became a scandalous affair. When Sister Isabel first arrived, it was Sister Genevieve, the quiet, watchful nun, who was assigned to be her mentor. Genevieve had seen dozens of girls like Isabel arrive, their eyes full of fear or defiance. But there was something different about this one, a spark that the Abbey had not yet extinguished. Struggling with the Abbey's bland, meager food, looked up and caught Genevieve's eye. She saw not judgment, but a flicker of understanding, of shared experience. As the nuns worked in the communal garden, Genevieve walked past Isabel and dropped a single, perfect strawberry at her feet, a flash of red against the dull brown earth. It wasn't a command or a lesson. In the silent, monitored world of the Abbey, it was an act of profound intimacy. This was the beginning of their secret language. An extra piece of bread left on Isabel's plate meant, "I am thinking of you." A pressed violet left inside a prayer book meant, "Meet me in the herb garden after Vespers." Spilled wine on a tablecloth could be a warning, a signal that the Mother Superior was watching them too closely. They were conducting a love affair in a language no one else could understand, right under the noses of their jailers. This wasn't unique to them. Nuns were creating these secret systems. Archaeologists renovating the monastery of Santa Clara in Spain found a hollow space behind an altar filled with dozens of love letters hidden for over 600 years. One, dated 1289, reads, "My dearest heart, I count the stones in my cell wall. 247. The same number of days since I last saw your face. They tell us that earthly love is a sin, but how can something that makes me feel closer to God's own creation be evil? I pray not for forgiveness, but for strength to love both heaven and you." These women were brilliant. They developed a system of tapping on the thin wooden walls that separated their sleeping cells at night. Different patterns meant different messages. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones might mean, "I'm thinking of you." Frantic tapping could signal danger, a surprise inspection by the Mother Superior. They even turned the architecture of their prison into a tool of connection. The cloisters, those covered walkways around the central courtyard, were designed for constant visibility. But these women became masters of light and shadow, learning which corners were blind spots from the Mother Superior's window at certain times of day. The confessional booth, a place of forced intimacy with a male priest, could become a secret meeting place, a dead drop for a hidden letter. These small rebellions were acts of incredible courage, but they came with terrible risks. The church knew about these secret languages, these particular friendships, and they had developed a system of punishment designed not just to hurt the body, but to break the soul. When a relationship was discovered, the punishment was creative and cruel. For months, a nun might be forced to stand before the entire convent every Sunday and confess her carnal thoughts. Shame was a more powerful weapon than any whip. A special white veil was often forced upon the penitent nun, a physical mark of her sin, broadcasting her transgression to every person she encountered. Solitary confinement was common. The in-pace, or in-peace, cell was a windowless room, sometimes barely large enough to lie down in. Here, a nun could be left for months or even years, with only bread and water, until her spirit was broken. But the most diabolical punishments were psychological. When the love between 2 nuns was discovered, they were often deliberately separated but kept within the same convent. They might be forced to see each other every day, at meals in chapel, in the garden, but forbidden from speaking, from acknowledging each other's existence in any way. It was a form of torture designed to make the very sight of the person you loved a source of constant, unending pain. For Isabel and Genevieve, their carefully constructed world came crashing down one spring morning. Coveting Genevieve's mentorship, reported them to the Mother Superior. She spoke of shared glances, of the strawberry, of the way they always seemed to know what the other was thinking. They were separated and interrogated. The investigators were masters of psychological warfare. They used information gleaned from months of surveillance to create an illusion of divine knowledge. Sister Isabel, the priest, said calmly, "On the feast of St. Agnes, you lingered in the garden for 7 minutes after the evening bell. What were you hoping to find there?" The questions were designed to make them feel that God himself was revealing their secrets, that their love was a stain on their souls visible to all holy men. Isabel, young and defiant, refused to confess to what she did not believe was a sin. Genevieve, older and more aware of the consequences, tried to protect her. She claimed it was all her fault, that she had led the younger sister astray. Her false confession was an act of love, an attempt to shield Isabel from the worst of the abbey's wrath, of the church's cruelty. Genevieve was sent to work in the convent infirmary, caring for the sick and dying, a task meant to expose her to suffering and death as a reminder of life's holy purpose. Because of her family's wealth and influence, was given a lighter sentence, but one that was perhaps more psychologically damaging. She was assigned a scriptorium, with the task of copying 1,000 times the passage from the Song of Solomon, "I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine." It was a verse of passionate love, and they forced her to write it over and over, turn the words of love into a tool of her punishment, a constant reminder of what she could never have. The church believed these methods would purge the disease of love, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the human heart. Suppressing love doesn't make it disappear. And for the nuns of medieval Europe, this constant pressure created a psychological powder keg that would eventually explode, not in open rebellion, but in a quiet, brilliant revolution of the soul. The systematic suppression of love took a devastating psychological toll. These women were trapped in an impossible situation, told that their most natural human instincts for connection and affection were demonic temptations. They had no language for what they were experiencing, no concept of mental health, depression, or anxiety. They were left to interpret their profound psychological suffering as spiritual failure, a sign of their own inherent wickedness. This created a vicious cycle of shame and despair. Discovered sealed inside a wall at an abbey in Poitiers, belonged to a nun named Sister Eleanor, spanning 15 years, are a harrowing case study in what we would now recognize as complex trauma. Her early entries are full of innocent affection for another sister. "I find myself staring at Sister Clemence during prayer. The way the morning light catches her hair beneath her veil makes my chest feel tight. Mother Superior says this is normal. She assures me it will pass." But it did not pass. Our brains are literally wired for connection. Modern neuroscience has shown that social rejection and emotional isolation activate the same neural pathways as physical pain. For these nuns, being forced to deny their need for human connection was a state of chronic, unending pain. Eleanor's journal entries grow darker over the years. "I've begun cutting small marks into my arm with the edge of my prayer book," she wrote a few years later. "The physical pain is easier to bear than this constant ache in my chest when I look at her. At least wounds heal. This feeling never does." This is a textbook description of self-harm, a desperate attempt to transmute unbearable emotional pain into something physical and manageable. When Eleanor confessed her impure thoughts to the convent priest, she was prescribed a standard spiritual medicine: more prayer, more fasting, more isolation. She was sentenced to sleep on the stone floor of her cell and spend 4 hours a day prostrated before the altar, begging God to purify her corrupted heart, only deepen her depression. "I prayed for death today," she wrote during this period. God will explain why he created hearts capable of love, then commanded us never to use them. Yet, even in this abyss, the human mind's capacity for adaptation is astonishing. Without any formal therapeutic techniques, these women develop sophisticated coping mechanisms. Like a nun named Marguerite Duint, practiced what she called holy imagination. Unable to express her love directly, she channeled her emotional energy into elaborate, beautiful visions where she and the nuns she loved were angels, serving together in heaven, finally free to embrace. This was not mere escapism. It was a form of what we now call narrative therapy, reframing a painful experience within a larger, meaningful story. Others developed spiritual friendships, relationships that stayed just within the bounds of church rules but provided crucial emotional support. They created a secret dialect, a coded language of piety. Instead of saying, "I love you, I pray for your soul's salvation," they would say, "I offer my suffering for your spiritual benefit." They were geniuses of linguistics, born of emotional desperation. The most powerful act of psychological rebellion, however, came from twisting the church's own theology against itself. The church taught that nuns were brides of Christ. This was intended to be a metaphor, a tool to make celibacy more palatable. But they made a critical error. They underestimated the intelligence and passion of the women they were trying to control. These nuns began to take the idea of mystical marriage literally. Jesus was their husband. Then experiencing intense, passionate, and even physical longing for him wasn't a sin. It was marital devotion. The mystical writings that emerged from this period are some of the most beautiful and revolutionary in Christian history. They read less like theological treatises and more like passionate love letters. St. Mechthald of Magdeburg wrote of her relationship with Christ in language that would make a romance novelist blush. When he comes to me in the night hours, my soul trembles with such sweet longing that I can scarce contain the joy. He speaks to me as a lover speaks to his beloved. This was a brilliant loophole. But the real revolution came when nuns began to apply this logic to their relationships with each other. If their highest call was to love Christ, and Christ himself commanded, "Love one another as I have loved you," then surely loving another woman with purity and devotion was not a sin. It was a reflection of divine love. Sister Isabel, separated from Genevieve, began to embrace this new theology. Her forced writing of the Song of Solomon became not a punishment, but an exploration. She began to see her love for Genevieve not as a distraction from God, but as a path to him. In a secret letter, smuggled to Genevieve in the binding of a book of remedies, she wrote, "They thought to punish me with the words of love, but they have given me a key. When the scripture says, 'My beloved is mine,' I see not only the face of Christ, but yours. Is not all true love a shadow of his light? In loving you, I am learning the very language of heaven." It gave women a theological framework to validate their own hearts, independent of male authority. A woman who truly believed she was in direct, loving communication with God was far less likely to blindly obey a priest or bishop who told her that her feelings were sinful. She could simply claim a higher authority. Some mystics, like Marguerite Porete, took this to its ultimate, terrifying conclusion, the mirror of simple souls, which argued that a soul in perfect union with God transcends the need for the church, its priests, and its sacraments. This was spiritual anarchy. It suggested that a woman could become her own pope. Marguerite was arrested, tried for heresy, and in 1310, burned at the stake in Paris. Her final words, as she faced the flames, were reportedly, "Love has no why." The church was facing a full-blown rebellion, not of swords and armies, but of hearts and minds, and it was about to get much worse. Scandals erupted that would expose the hypocrisy at the very heart of the system. In 1277, the abbess of St. Denis, a woman so revered she was considered a living saint, was discovered in a passionate relationship with her own female treasurer. She presented a defense so brilliant it left the court speechless. She argued that her love for her sister was a form of worship, a way of practicing the selfless love Christ commanded. She argued. Then the judges were condemning the very heart of the gospel. The church had created a monster it could no longer control. But the final liberation would come not from within, but from a revolution that would shatter the medieval world forever. While the church was fighting a theological war against love, it was also protecting a vast economic empire built on the very system of celibacy it so fiercely enforced. The vow of poverty was a lie. When a wealthy woman like Sister Isabel entered a convent, her family's dowry, often a fortune in land, rents, and gold, became the church's property. The prohibition against nuns marrying and having children wasn't just about spiritual purity. It was about preventing the existence of heirs who could legally reclaim that wealth. Nuns was, in essence, a brilliant financial strategy that made the church one of the largest landowners in Europe. The women were the assets, and their love lives were a direct threat. This economic reality explains the brutality of the punishments. A nun who left for love wasn't just risking her soul. She was threatening the convent's budget, built on greed and suppression, could not last forever. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, and in doing so, he lit a fire that would burn across Europe. The Protestant Reformation was about to begin, and for thousands of nuns trapped in loveless lives, it was a declaration of independence. Luther and other reformers attacked the very foundations of monastic life. They argued that forced celibacy was unnatural and contrary to God's will. They preached that marriage was a holy state, and that a direct relationship with God required no intermediary priest or mother superior. For the women in the convents, these were not abstract theological debates. They were a key, unlocking the door of their gilded cage. Nuns began walking out of convents, not as disgraced runaways, but as liberated women making a conscious, theological choice. The most famous of these was Katharina von Bora. In 1523, on the night before Easter, she and 11 other nuns staged a daring escape from their convent. They were smuggled out in empty herring barrels by a merchant sympathetic. Katharina's story is revolutionary. She didn't flee into the arms of the first man who would have her. She lived independently for 2 years, supporting herself and refusing several proposals. She was a woman who had learned the value of her own heart and would not give it away lightly. She eventually chose to marry Martin Luther himself, not as a dependent, but as a partner. Her letters to him show a woman of incredible strength and clarity. "I have spent too many years with my heart in chains," she wrote, "to accept any partnership that does not honor the freedom Christ died to give us. If we marry, it will be as equals in love." The story of Isabel and Genevieve, which we have followed, found its own resolution in this whirlwind of change. As the Reformation swept through France, the authority of the old church began to crumble. Their abbey, once an unbreachable fortress, was thrown into chaos. One night, aided by a sympathetic priest who had embraced the new teachings, Isabel and Genevieve walked out the gates of Fontevraud, not as penitent sinners, but as free women. They traveled to Geneva, a city that had become a haven for reformers, and for the first time, they lived not in secret, but in the open. They never married in a legal sense. The world was not yet ready for that, but they built a life together. They used the education the church had given them to open a small school for girls, teaching them not just to read and write, but to think for themselves. They created a home filled with the warmth and affection they had been denied for so long. Their life was a quiet, powerful testament to a love that had refused to die. Across Europe, thousands of similar stories were unfolding. When King Henry VIII of England dissolved the monasteries, thousands of nuns were suddenly freed. While some were left destitute, many, particularly the educated ones, thrived. They became merchants, teachers, writers, and community leaders. And surviving records show that a remarkable number of them chose to spend their new lives with the very women they had loved in the convents. They had finally found a world that had a place for them. They seized it with both hands. These women, who had been taught that their love was a sin, became pioneers. They helped to build a new society where choice, companionship, and love were seen not as dangers, but as divine gifts. They had been forged in the fires of prohibition, and they emerged with an unbreakable understanding of what freedom was truly worth. Looking back at this incredible history, at these stories of forbidden love and courageous hearts, it's clear that these medieval women were not so different from us. They faced the same fundamental human questions we all face. How do you stay true to your heart in a world that demands conformity? How do you find the courage to love when the cost seems impossibly high? Their legacy is a powerful reminder that love, in its most authentic form, is a revolutionary act. It challenges systems of control, it questions unjust authority, and it insists on profound, undeniable value of human connection. The church built stone walls, forged iron rules, and devised a system of psychological torture to contain it, but they failed. Love survived. It whispered through walls. It bloomed in secret gardens, and it eventually broke free, helping to reshape the world. The courage of these women created ripples that have reached us today. Their quiet resistance laid the groundwork for a world where we have more freedom to love than they could have ever imagined. Their story proves that no institution, no matter how powerful, can ever truly defeat the human heart. The story of love is the story of humanity. It's written in every culture and in every age. And sometimes the most powerful chapters are the ones that were meant to be erased. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden heart of the past, for listening to the whispers that refuse to be silenced. If these voices in the past have moved you, help me ensure they are never silenced again. By subscribing to our channel, you become a guardian of these stories. And by sharing your own thoughts in the comments, you join a conversation that spans centuries, a conversation about the enduring, unconquerable power of love. Until next time, remember the courage of those who loved in the shadows, and cherish the light that their bravery helped to create.